and I'm really glad to have you all here. We think the gender pay gap is a really important topic, and we just want to come up with policies and ideas to help employers alleviate the problem. So we have an amazing panel who really need no introduction, but I will introduce them anyway. We have on my far right, Her Honour Judge Dhir, who currently sits on the Old Bailey bench. We have to my right, Her Honour Judge Kent, who sits on the Kingston Crown Court bench. We have to my left, Sarah Ellington, who's a senior associate at DLA Piper. And to my far left, we have Professor Janet Walsh, who's in our own faculty at King's, and who's an international expert on employment and female careers.
Putting me under pressure.
So without further ado, let's begin. The first topic is maternity leave. So Judge Dhir, if you could tell us what impact, if any, maternity leave has on the gender pay gap.
As you'll have worked out from my introduction, I'm a lawyer, so I have to give a legal type of answer to this, or a lawyer answer, which is it depends. And it depends on the job you do, the time you take off, your employer, and your colleagues. I've got 3 kids. I had them late in life. And for me, when I went back to work, there was no change from the people in my set of chambers, my workplace. The big change was me. I'd changed. I didn't really want to go out for drinks with solicitors, potential clients for me as a barrister, anymore in the evening. I wanted to go home. And actually, I didn't have the weekends to recover from 5 heavy days in court. I needed the week to recover from the weekend. My priorities changed. I wasn't ready to just drop everything and rush off to Liverpool Crown Court for 3 weeks for that brilliant case that had come along. And so it depends on what you're doing and what your job demands of you. As a barrister, and I was a criminal barrister, or should I say a barrister practicing crime, I did go all over the country to do cases. I would cancel evening arrangements at the drop of a hat if I had to work, because I was building up a career, and that involved showing commitment to the career and working very long hours. I was used to turning up at court looking bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and dressed immaculately, of course, in expensive clothing that didn't have milk on it. And all of a sudden I went from that person who was completely focused on my job to thinking of this child 24 hours 7. And I remember saying to my husband one evening when my daughter was about 6 months old, and I said to him, when you leave home, do you think about Nikita all day long? He said, no. I said, well, do you think about her at all? No. Okay. Whereas she was the only thing in my mind. Sometimes I was sitting in court thinking, just hurry this along, please, because I'd really like to get home. So the answer to this is that, of course, it has an impact. In some professions, it has an enormous impact. And the legal profession is traditionally one of them. So when lawyers are coming into the profession, it's about 50-50. 50% female, 50% male. And if those females are anything like me, they really truly believe that they are going to have an equal career path to the men. That's what I thought. If you look 10 years later, many have dropped away. And if you look 20 years on, then there's a handful of females left. And that's because actually it's really very difficult to get back into the way of practice and keep building your practice once you've had children. So it's not the time you take off necessarily, it's the job you're doing and the attitude of those around you. I was quite lucky. in that I was established by the time I had my children, because I was older. And so I was able to say to my clerks, I will not travel. I will only do cases that are at the Old Bailey, that are at Southwark, and that are at the Royal Courts of Justice. So I managed to stay in the profession. I'm just going to say one more thing and then let some other people speak. I realised when I took Silk, which has become a Queen's Counsel in 2010, what a huge impact there is for women in the legal profession. When I got Silk, there were 20 women that year, 70 men. Well, I thought that was quite shocking. But a few days later, a woman sent me a letter telling me that I was the 236th woman ever to have got Silk. Now, if you think about that, 70 men in my year. So in about 3 years, there are as many men getting Silk as there ever have been women. And a lot of that is to do with children and the responsibilities and the changes that children bring to families, and that the impact of that is felt more by women.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think it's something like 20% of all Queen's Counsel are women. Now, Professor Walsh, going on from that, does this differ in different sectors? Because we have the barrister perspective.
I mean, are you referring to different sectors of the law or different industries, occupations?
Both.
Okay. This is a tough one. I'm going to come at this from, you know, what the kind of academic research evidence says. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not in the law school. I'm actually a professor in the School of Management and Business, and my area is human resource management, and actually my background is a labour market economist. So that's, you know, where I'm coming from. If you look at the kind of academic research evidence on maternity leave, what you find is that maternity leave has both positive and negative effects for women. On the positive side, what we can say is it actually does boost women's employment rates. And it does this because it provides incentives to women to remain with their employer. And it's been, you know, terribly important for women, both in the UK and elsewhere, to actually have been in receipt of paid maternity leave, and for those entitlements to have increased over the past, you know, 10, 15, 20 years. Now, there's a distinction to be made, and I think Anuta's talking about that in terms of, you know, if you take short or lengthy periods of leave, because the OECD has recently looked into this and looked at the labour market effects of parental leave across, you know, about 30 countries. And what they found was that parental leave policies had a positive role in the rise of female employment, and that was particularly so for relatively short periods of leave. But it was much more problematic for longer periods of leave, more than 2 years. And what they found was that particularly for low-paid women, and again, one of my criticisms of the debate about the gender pay gap is we talk an awful lot about women getting onto boards and, you know, women reaching the high spheres of, you know, law firms and, you know, financial services companies. But actually, the gap is is most marked now for part-time women, and they tend to be low-paid women. And low-paid employees are less likely to return to work if they take long periods of leave. Now, in terms of the impact on pay, I mean, it does tend to be negative. I mean, it's been found that Canadian mothers who return to work took about 7 years to recover their lost earnings, and that's what the OECD found. I mean, that seems to be the basic finding, that it does affect women. It slows down women's career progression, and therefore it slows down, you know, their earnings. Now, in terms of this, I mean, it's really actually quite a complicated question. Does it differ in different sectors? Now, you really need very sophisticated data to answer this question rigorously. American researchers have done really fascinating work where they've actually tried to track graduates in a number of different occupations for a long period of time. So, you know, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years out from when they graduate. And what they've found is that there are actually penalties for taking time out of employment, and this varies according to occupation. It seems to be most marked for MBA graduates. It's also marked for law graduates and medical graduates, but less than for MBA graduates. It was MBA graduates, and this is studies done at Harvard and Chicago. They suffered the most marked pay penalties. So it's something like, if they took on average 18-month breaks from employment, it was associated with something like a 41% decrease in earnings. Now, why? Well, what it tends to reflect is the fact that women, female MBA graduates, actually had more career interruptions than male MBA graduates. And what that meant is that they accumulated less job experience. They also shifted to work shorter hours, including more work in part-time positions. And it was very much associated with the presence of children, particularly the first child. Now you might say, well, wouldn't we predict that? But what's really interesting about this research is that actually taking quite short periods of leave had a really major impact, a disproportionate impact on their earnings. And it amounts to something over time of hundreds of thousands of American dollars. And the average time taken out of the labour market is actually quite small. It's something like, on average, 12 months. So we're not talking about really lengthy periods of time out here. Now, other occupations are somewhat different, and the same group of researchers did some work, these are economists, did some work on pharmacists, which interestingly in the United States is the third highest paying profession for women. It's a high paid profession for both men and women, but it has one of the lowest gender earnings gaps. What is it about pharmacy that's different from where MBA graduates end up, which tends to be in the corporate and financial sectors? Well, they found that part-time work was much more widespread, and therefore women didn't take as much parental leave as for MBA graduates. And the consequence was that female pharmacists had much higher employment rates. When they looked at the corporate sector and in parts of the law, although this is changing, flexible working is either less widespread or it's associated with a high cost to individuals. And it's argued that's because people don't have good substitutes for themselves in certain cases. So if you're doing a merger and acquisition and you're a financier, you have to turn up because it's your client. You have to be there for your client at 2 in the morning on Sunday or on holidays, etc. Whereas in pharmacy, what you have is people work in teams of employees who have, if you like, similar kinds of expertise, and so can be substituted for one another. They can cover for each other in servicing clients, customers, or patients. So, I'll just end there, but basically what's the lesson of all this? Well, for full-time women, the emphasis really has to be on genuine workplace flexibility and effective work-life policies as much as it is on pay. And that indeed was the conclusion of the House of Commons Committee on the Gender Pay Gap, which reported recently. It noted that flexible working for all lay at the heart of addressing the gender pay gap. And at the same time, there's a need to promote men's participation in work-life benefits and flexible working. So I'll just leave it there.
Great, thank you for that. Now we have another big one, and that's that in Sweden there's actually a scheme of compulsory paternity leave, in that if you're a couple and you do want to take maternity or paternity leave, a third has to go to the mother, a third has to go to the father, and then a third you can decide on your own. Miss Ellington, do you think we should adopt such a scheme in the UK?
Okay, well, first of all, I'd just like to say a few balancing remarks to what we first heard about maternity leave. Because as was mentioned, it really differs across every single person. And I have to say that in contrast, my experience was hugely positive And the main outcome from my maternity leave was that I actually realised how much I loved my job. I loved being able to finish an entire cup of coffee. I loved being able to close the door when I went to the toilet and not have people constantly interrupting me. And in particular, I loved being able to focus entirely on my job and not have that kind of constant worry all day that you said that you had. And we'll come on into a minute one of the reasons why I think that was the case for me. But the other effect of it, certainly in my second maternity leave, was that my firm and the partners that I worked directly for realised how much they love me. So in fact, I was due to take 6 months off, and about 6 weeks before I was due to come back, I was asked if I would start coming in 1 day a week before I was due to come back, because basically they couldn't cope by themselves. So I think, you know, there's various reasons that you can be out of the office, and there's various ways in which this can be perceived, but it can be a really positive thing. But it is all about perceptions, and it's about you as a person taking that leave, reinforcing those perceptions. So I have to say the only negative experience I've had through all of this is when I sat down in one of my reviews to tell my 2 line managers, both men, that I was expecting my second child. And the first thing they said to me was, oh, congratulations, that's great, the firm has some great flexible working policies. And I said to them, have you not met me before? There's absolutely no way that I'm going to sit at home 2 days a week and look after my children. It's not that they're not lovely, it's not that they don't bring a tear to my eye when they do something great, but my vocation is not childcare. My vocation is being an amazing litigator. And perhaps it's been easier for me because my husband's taken such an active role. So for both our children, and one was born about 14 months ago, so under the new shared parental leave regime, and one was born before that regime came in, but unbeknownst to many people, there was actually a very similar scheme in place, whereby you could still share the full 12 months of paternity leave. So each time I took 6 months off, and then he took 3 months afterwards. The first time I only took 6 months off because he forced me to, my husband forced me to. I was actually on the phone to him after 4 months saying I really can't cope with this anymore, I want to go back to my corporate environment. And he told me that no normal person takes less than 6 months maternity leave, which is probably not what other people on the panel took either, may or may not be.
2 weeks for the first
Yeah.
which was a disaster. Sorry.
So I think that, you know, obviously perceptions have changed over time as well. But because he takes a very active role.
I'm sure she'll manage for a little while.
But because my husband takes a very active role, and I think he does that because he had that experience where he was by himself. And certainly with our second child, when I went back to work, it was very full on. And he actually told me he thought he must be a single parent for his whole paternity leave. Because I was literally working about 15 to 17 hours a day, every day, for that entire 3-month period. So it was actually very lucky the timing that he was off, because he could take care of everything. But I also joke that if the nursery want to just leave a message, which they have to do sometimes, you know, if the child bumps their head and they've got these policies in place, then they call me. If they actually want to speak to someone and have something happen, then they call my husband, because he's the one that will actually answer the phone in the middle of the workday, and I won't, because I really value having kind of my personal space. So as to whether we should follow the Swedish model,
I mean, it's a really difficult one because, you know, there's a lot of people who really value, a lot of women who really value being able to take an entire year off. And that's something which is being fought very hard for. And obviously there's this biological imperative that if you want your child to be breastfed for a year, then a woman's going to have to take a year off and work in order to be able to do that, unless you have a nanny who pops into your office. And you don't have an office like most of us do with clear glass, so that you could actually feed your child in your office and go about it that way. And I've actually heard a lot of men in my office saying that they wouldn't be allowed to take any paternity leave because their wives told them, don't you think about taking any of my year, this belongs to me, it doesn't belong to you. But I have to say that overall, I am in favour of it. It would be nice for men to be able to afford to take time off work and for it not to be a financial penalty to do that. I have to say it also works well in my household because I get paid more than my husband, which means that I could tell him that, you know, there was absolutely no excuse for him not to take time off. But, you know, people have made comments to him over time about how it might wreck his career to take 3 months paternity leave, which I think is ridiculous because he's a transactional lawyer. So his transactions last a couple of months. If you're off for one transaction, that's just one transaction that's gone by. I'm a litigator, and in fact most of my cases, people I'd worked very hard to do absolutely nothing on whilst I was away and leave them entirely intact for me when I got back, which probably wasn't the best thing either. But really, I think sometimes with all of these things, we spend far too much time thinking about how we can move women forwards, which is obviously what we want to do. We need to address this. But my feeling is that that's only ever going to be done when we reach actual equality. And that means not allowing women to have flexible working, but allowing everyone to have flexible working. Not allowing people to work flexibly for childcare, but allowing people to work flexibly for whatever they want to do with the rest of their time. And I think that as we move forward, actually that's something that society, as a great society as a whole, and you see this certainly within the trainees that are coming into our firm now, are really demanding more flexibility. And unless firms take a hold of that and understand it and change the dynamics of what they're doing to encourage all of these issues, then they're not going to benefit from the best people going forwards.
Sorry about the coughing. I'm a bit ill. Of course I get ill on this evening. But thank you for that. Before we move on from this topic, does anyone else have any comments?
Probably lots, but we'd never move on from that topic, so might be better to store it up.
So the next topic is affirmative action. Judge Kent, do you think positive discriminations, like quotas essentially, is a viable option, or would it cause less qualified candidates to be considered?
Okay, well, that's a two-part question, and one, as you know, with exams, you should always read the question and then answer the question. So let's deal with it in two parts. The first question is positive discrimination a viable option? And being a lawyer, I'd have to say no and yes. No, because at the moment that would be unlawful. So it would require a change of law. The law doesn't allow us at the moment to have positive discrimination. The maximum or the high point of what you can do is essentially to have what we call the equal merit provision. So if you have two people of equal merit, then you can put forward the person with protected characteristics, but you have to make a judgment that there is equal merit. So at this stage you can't do it. Yes, because of course we could change the law It is not my impression that there is the will at the moment, no matter how much concern there is about equality. I don't think there is the will to change the law to allow positive discrimination at this stage. A lot of people talk about it and talk about whether it'd be a good idea, but I don't see a bill like that being passed through Parliament. Would it cause less qualified candidates to be considered? And I'm afraid the answer to that has to be yes. And it has to be yes because at this stage we have the equal merit provision, which means that equal candidates are considered and you can put forward the person with the protected characteristics. So anything more than that must mean that it would cause less qualified candidates to be considered or put forward. As I was a barrister for 19 years and then I became a circuit judge, and I've been a circuit judge for 7 years. So I've spent plenty of time in a profession where there have been relatively few women, and relatively few women who then are retained within the profession, particularly once you have children. So I've had 3 children, and sometimes it has been a relief to go to work. The big problem is always the fact that you constantly struggle against the assumption that somehow you're there because you're female or you're brown or you're young or you're something else and someone else has promoted you. And those of us who like to think that we've got there on our own merit actually really don't need to fight that assumption as well. I think there's a real danger that if you did put forward if you did have such a provision in place, in other words, that you could allow positive discrimination, you could do a huge amount of damage to those who, of course, have achieved through their own merit. You cause a huge amount of resentment because, of course, why should other people who, it's not your average male's fault that he was born in this generation and not the last one. Why should they be discriminated against if they've worked just as hard? Why should your average Anglo-Saxon be discriminated against? It's not their fault they're born in this generation, not the last one. You can't pay back for the things that have gone wrong in the last generation. But also, I think that the great danger is that you undermined the achievements of those who then have got through, one would hope, on merit. So for all sorts of reasons, although it's attractive, my own view at the moment is you can't have positive discrimination, and at the moment I wouldn't advocate that you have positive discrimination.
Does everyone agree with that, or are there any other comments?
I think it depends.
Of course.
I remember the first time I sat as a part-time judge, and I went into the dining room, the judge's dining room, and it was a sea of white men with white hair. And they thought in a particular way, and they had particular attitudes. And that's because they were always together. They'd all come from the same sort of school and the same sort of background. And they all dispensed justice in about roughly the same way. One was a bit grumpier than the other, one was a bit younger than the other, and so on and so forth. But I then went to a court where there were 2 women, quite different women, to each other and different to me. And the difference around the table was enormous. And I think that women have something to give to the workplace. It's not just what the workplace can give us, it's what we can bring to the party. A different perspective, perhaps. A different way of dealing with people. When lunch was served, these women, would you believe, said thank you to the staff. They smiled and they looked at the staff when they said thank you. And that meant the men started to feel they too should say thank you. And so we have something to bring. And if we do have something to bring, shouldn't there be something to help us along the way? Certainly in professions in which we're underrepresented. And so I think a little bit of positive discrimination would be a good thing.
Just a little, just a tad.
Well, maybe not a little, maybe a lot, but something has to be done in the professions in which there are far too few women?
The other lawyerly response to the question is, what does less qualified actually mean?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I agree.
Is it
Yeah.
less qualified to be exactly the same as everyone else is there? And I have to say that one of my favourite panels that I ever went to, I don't like singing praises for people from other law firms because obviously we're competitors, but there was a partner there from CMS, and his point was, and if you haven't yet experienced law firms in general, excuse me that after you've been there a few years you get a bit more cynical. He said, how many mediocre women partners of law firms have you ever met? None. They're all amazing. How many mediocre male partners have you met? Sorry, even in my firm, which is obviously excellent, quite a few. And how did they get through the door compared to all of the other women that could have taken their place? Because they were so similar to the other people. Because our society and the way that firms were formed and the way that people grew up within those firms has been to accept a certain model.
Like them.
Exactly like themselves. And now with the generational differences which we're seeing coming through in the workforce, we've had the millennials and now we're on to the next generation who wants different things from their work. It would be a mistake to keep hiring exactly those same people in. We need different perspectives. We need people who are different. These aren't less qualified people, they're just different people.
Yeah.
And when you're in a firm, you're supposed to be working as a team, and teams work better where there's different perspectives.
Leading on from that, again, this question is for you. Are targets a possible substitute to quotas? Are they effective or are they ignored?
So obviously the main difference between targets being that they're voluntary and quotas are imposed. Do targets really work? There's been quite a lot of debate about this. People say no, they don't actually, because it's voluntary, you set them yourselves, so of course you're just going to set something that's really easy to achieve. And in fact, as a firm, DLA Piper have chosen not to set targets. Our poor D&I manager has got a lot of stick in relation to this from the press. But what we wanted to do was to not ever put any of our women in the position where you get promoted to a partnership and like you were saying before, people have the very opportunity, even though we all know that it's not true, to say you got there because there was this target that had to be fulfilled. There shouldn't be the possibility of that. Even though we know it wouldn't be true, it gives the possibility for whispering that behind someone's back. Everyone gets frustrated with the pace of change, especially in issues like this, which are very set within our society, within the way we've brought up, within our own personal biases, and it's women that have those biases as well as men. This isn't something that's going to change overnight, and we want to set targets for it in order to speed up the pace of change, but sometimes that can go a bit too far. I know we want things to change quicker, but my personal view is that if society isn't ready for it, if it's not organic, then these are only going to cause the whispering behind people's backs, which is really against what we're trying to achieve.
Great. Professor Walsh, are there any other policies which could be adopted by employers to help get women to top positions?
Well, there are lots of things that employers can do and actually are doing. I mean, two things prior to that. I mean, one is that I think Sarah just talked about generational change, and I think that there are really interesting generational changes occurring. And just as a piece of information, I mean, the gender pay gap has almost been eliminated now in the UK for women under under the age of 40. That's the full-time gender earnings gap. Indeed, for young women aged 22 to 29, they on average, their hourly earnings exceed men's. The gender pay gap is actually largest for women of my age group, for women in their 50s, and that's probably a result of accumulated leave, entitlement, those things we'll just be talking about, as well as probably an element of discrimination too. I am actually pretty sceptical about quotas and positive discrimination. I mean, there's been a lot of research about the impact of affirmative action in the United States, and that research suggests that quotas often have unintended negative effects, that people tend to associate these kinds of programs with preferential treatment for women, and as the speakers have said, it can lead to perceptions of unfairness. It's also been found that women are less likely to be interested in taking up managerial jobs when they perceive that the female incumbents in those jobs had acquired those positions through preferential treatment based on gender. So I'm afraid I'm a great believer that merit has to be central to all recruitment and promotion decisions. I'm more sympathetic towards, voluntary targets. I think if you've looked at, if we look at trends in terms of, getting more women on boards, the voluntary target set by Davis, the Davis report, which was a target of 25% female representation on boards of FTSE 100 listed companies, I mean, that appeared to have worked, so I'm kind of somewhat more sympathetic to that. In terms of other policies that I think we should be looking at, we've already talked about flexible working and, degendering that. And I'm a great believer in that. This is not simply about women. This is about men and women. And it's about, the quality of life, and it's about, men also sharing time with kids, or, if people haven't got kids, actually doing the things that they kind of want to do. So it's about, us, if you like, changing our attitudes towards the whole issue of work-life balance. And part of that is tackling the culture of presenteeism, FaceTime and long work hours. And that is pretty endemic. We're probably all residents of London. That is pretty endemic in London and in the city, across occupations. Now, a lot of my students want to go and work for management consulting firms. That's their big favourite. It used to be investment banks, but since 2008 to 9, it's, actually it's not really. Now, Boston Consulting Group, which a lot of students kind of aspire to on McKinsey's, they tried to change their consultants' work patterns, and that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. Nearly half of Boston Consulting Group consultants work something like more than 65 hours a week, and they spent something like 20 to 25 hours monitoring their mobiles outside of the office. And there was an expectation, and they called it, they had to be always on, 24/7 working. They had to be almost immediately responsive to their clients and to their colleagues. So what they did, in association with actually a researcher from Harvard, they introduced a series of what was called predictable time-off experiments. And during these time-off periods, which could be people taking one full day off in the middle of the week, or an evening off in the middle of the week, and that apparently for consultants was a really hard thing to do, because they wanted to cram all their work and work really intensively during the week, but then have kind of weekends off, if you like. During those time-off periods, people, they couldn't check their emails or voicemails, and the consultants found that really hard to do, because they've been doing it for so long. The experiments actually were successful. They continued with them during the financial crash in the States, very hard thing to do. And not only did these experiments improve their consultants' well-being, but it also improved their service to the client. It also led to higher retention of talent and to gains in quality and efficiency. So those are the kinds of things I think that employers need to look at. The other thing is about sponsorship of women, and that can help, and it isn't the same as mentoring. What researchers found is that high potential women are often over-mentored. You know, they get lots of advice, lots of feedback, but they tend to be under-sponsored relative to their male colleagues. And without sponsorship, and that, by that I mean senior managers acting as advocates for them during promotion. So, you know, I guess in law firms it will be when all the partners get together and decide about who's going to be promoted. It would be really helpful to have someone there acting as a sponsor for women. And I mean, now sponsorship programs are pretty widespread in large firms like Unilever, IBM, Europe and so on. So I think, you know, that kind of thing can be helpful. And the other issue is I think that we need to prepare women for senior positions by giving them challenging work assignments. And again, that goes back to what Sarah's saying, that often what managers will do, whether they're women or men, is make assumptions about what women want, either because they have children or they might have them in the future. So often line managers, whether they're men or women, will assume that women have greater family to work conflict than men, even when they don't, and even when they don't have children. So, you know, we need women to be given these very important, challenging, if you like, stretch assignments.
Great, thank you. We should move on to the topic of publication of salary information, but before we do, does anyone have anything more to say on that topic? No, great. So, Judge Dhir, should employers be legally compelled to publish salary information, or should they do so voluntarily?
They should be compelled. Transparency is good. I want to know what someone of the same rank as me is earning. Why shouldn't I know? You'll all have heard of the Equal Pay Act. Men and women are meant to be paid the same for the same job. So the figures should show that that's the case. It's quite interesting. Georgina gave me this. I didn't look this up myself. When the Equalities Act of 2010 came in, there had been a push for this, for it to be compulsory for firms to publish the information. And instead they went for a voluntary approach. And just how many companies do you think voluntarily publish the data? Any guesses? How many do you think? Actually, it's better than zero. Okay. Better than zero. Got a few. 5. Now, they're big companies, so Tesco, for example, Friends Life, PwC, and it's easier for big firms, isn't it? And that's one of the problems with my answer of yes. Does that apply to a firm employing 100 people, and how much would it cost them? And is that money that they're spending on publishing the figures and not paying their employees? So, of course, I come back to depends, but my primary position is yes. Because if it's 5 when it's voluntary, then we have to start wondering, what's that all about? So I personally, it'll come as a surprise to all of you now, having heard 3 answers from me, I'm into naming and shaming and bringing about change. Not tomorrow or in 10 years' time, not, forgive me, for the under 40s, but for all women in the workplace, even the over 50s. I was looking at the statistics, this bit of work I did myself, and it's in the Times today. For full-time employed women and part-time employed women, the difference in pay between men and women, 19.2%. We earn 80 pence for every pound a man earns. Well, that is shocking. And I want to know why.